Presented by Caltech.
I'm Logan Cross. I'm a graduate student in computation and neural systems, and I work in John O'Doherty's lab. So I'm a decision-making neuroscientist, and you might be asking, why study the neuroscience of decision-making? The first reason is a basic science question. The decision-making circuit in the brain is not well understood at all. We know some things, like that the prefrontal cortex is highly involved in it, but we're just beginning to understand what's happening at the computational level when you're making everyday decisions. The second reason is that the decision-making mechanisms in the brain often break down in patients with psychiatric disorders and that are suffering from addiction. For example, drug addicts are driven by their impulses, and they often continue to use drugs even when the drugs no longer give them pleasure. Then this last reason is that, in my opinion, decision-making mechanisms are fundamental to general intelligence. And if we ever want to build machines, artificial general intelligence that can act in the world, they will need to have sophisticated decision-making mechanisms, potentially ones that are similar to the ones that are in the brain. And so more specifically in our lab, we study reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is this really interesting field that developed between crosstalk between psychologists, neuroscientists, and computer scientists. And I think a good way to look at the contributions that reinforcement learning has made is with Marr's 3 levels of analysis. And so David Marr is a computational neuroscientist that thought that you could think about a computational system through these 3 levels. The computational level is about the computational problem that you're trying to solve. So in reinforcement learning, this is how does an AI, human, or animal maximize reward and minimize punishment? Then the algorithmic level is what algorithms do AI, humans, or animals use to learn where reward is in the world and how to get there. And then finally, you can ask implementational questions like, how are these learning and decision-making algorithms implemented in the brain? And how can we implement them in computers in a computationally efficient manner? So I'll kind of go over this again through the example of a grid world. So imagine that you're a mouse or you're an agent and you have to move around in this grid world. And at the top right corner of the grid world, there's reward. Let's say it's some cheese that gives you +2 reward. But in the right side of the grid world, there's punishment, like a mild electric shock, that gives you -1 reward. So the computational problem here is, how do you map states to actions? How do you learn where to navigate in this world in order to maximize long-term reward? And so reinforcement learning starts to break down this grid world into this framework, where you can define every square in the grid world as a different state, and then you select actions to move from state to state, basically. And as you move from state to state, you may or may not get reward or punishment. And over time, you need to learn which actions to take in particular states. And so temporal difference learning is an example of one of the algorithms that is useful for this sort of problem. And what temporal difference learning does is it estimates the value of being in every state. So basically, you might start off estimating the value of every state at a value of 0 or a neutral value. And then as you explore the world, you eventually might stumble upon some reward. And when you stumble upon some reward, the algorithmic trick here is to use a prediction error to update your value estimate of the state that was directly preceding reward. And so here's more of a concrete example of what could happen if you're a rat or a mouse and you're taking this trajectory, let's say, and eventually you stumble upon the cheese in this top right corner here. Then you can use a positive prediction error in this scenario to update the value of the states that preceded the cheese. So now your value estimate of these states is that they have a higher value, which is reflected in these darker blue circles in the states along this trajectory. And then here's an opposite example where, let's say, you start out on the right side of this grid world near the hazard, and you eventually navigate into this hazardous area to get -1 reward. Now you update your value of the states that were preceding this hazard with the negative prediction error. So now they have more of a negative or low value that corresponds to these states, which is reflected in this brown color in these circles. And over time, as you take hundreds of trajectories, as you do this in a number of trials, you might converge to a value function like this on the right, where the states that are closest to the reward have a higher value attached to them, and states that are further away from the reward and that are closer to the hazard have a lower value attached to them, or potentially a negative value. And then basically your policy in this case is to just move to states of the world that have higher value. And by doing that, you can maximize long-term reward. And so these temporal difference learning algorithms and other similar algorithms are really good at explaining animal and human behavior on very simple tasks, like this grid world task or in operant conditioning tasks. But even more interestingly, numerous studies have found representations of components of these algorithms in the human brain. So for example, my advisor, John O'Doherty, in 2004 with other researchers, found correlates of prediction errors in this striatum in the human brain using fMRI. And other studies that have been done in animals with electrophysiology have isolated what's really going on in the circuit, and it seems that dopaminergic signaling in the midbrain signals prediction errors, and then these dopamine neurons project to these striatum regions, as you see here. And so reinforcement learning describes algorithmic solutions for selecting actions to maximize long-term reward. And as I just showed you, we have lots of evidence in neuroscience for implementation of these algorithms in the brain. However, classic reinforcement learning frameworks start to break in environments of real-world complexity. And this is because the state space becomes extraordinarily large in real-world environments. So take the example of driving a car, let's say. When you're driving a car, lots of visual information hits your retina and has to be processed by the brain. And classic RL would say that you would have to define a new state anytime that the visual information that comes to your brain is different from something that you saw in the past. But clearly this is not what the brain is doing, right? Every single time you're driving, the visual information that you see is completely unique. The configurations of cars are likely to be completely unique, and you can drive on new streets or in new cities seamlessly without having to relearn the driving process. And so what the brain must be doing is it must be taking this high dimensional information and compressing it into a lower dimensional space that allows it to generalize to new environments and new conditions. And so how is the brain solving problems like these? You might think that the mapping from visual input to an output action in these situations is actually highly nonlinear. And because of this, can we get inspiration from modern deep learning tools? Because these modern deep learning tools are very good at handling situations where the mapping from input to outputs are highly nonlinear. And in 2015, Google DeepMind developed this algorithm called the DeepQ network that could learn to play dozens of Atari video games at human and superhuman levels. And it also kicked off the field of deep reinforcement learning. And what this algorithm specifically does is it takes in the pixels in a particular game and then uses convolutional layers to process the image. And these convolutional networks are very useful for image recognition. And then these convolutional networks are basically combined with reinforcement learning methods similar to the temporal difference learning methods that I went over before. And through trial and error, this agent can learn which actions to take in particular situations in a game. And so you can think of this problem now also on Mars 3 levels of analysis. Now the computational problem is, how does an AI, human, or animal evaluate actions in a high-dimensional environment? And the algorithmic solution that came from AI is to use deep learning to approximate the value function and do state representation. And then the implementational question is something that I'm really interested in this project that I'm talking about today, which is there a distributed network in the brain that constructs state representations similar to deep RL algorithms? And so what we did is we had human subjects freely play Atari video games in an fMRI scanner. And the subjects were scanned on 4 separate days for a total of 4.5 hours, so a lot of scanning for each of our participants. And they played these 3 games, Enduro, Pong, and Space Invaders. And so They use a button box as a controller, and you can hold this with two hands, basically like a PlayStation controller, and with your left hand you can navigate your agent left and right, and with your right hand you can press fire. This enduro game, the object of the game is basically to drive as fast as possible while avoiding other cars. And the weather conditions change throughout the game, and it goes from daylight to nighttime as well. And in Pong, this is the classic Atari video game where you're basically just trying to get the ball past your opponent while defending your own goal. And Space Invader is another classic where you control this agent at the bottom of the screen, and you just want to destroy the enemy ships that are above you and avoid being hit by their missiles. And so we took multiple approaches to analyzing this data. The first approach was to ask where in the brain are action values and state values. And in particular, do regions correlate with the action values and state values in the DQN? And so what do action values and state values look like in Atari? So here's an example right here where you're controlling the green paddle on the right, and basically the ball is about to go underneath you. So your action value should be very high for moving down and should be low or negative for the other available actions. You really need to move down in order to block the ball. And your state value in this situation is very negative because you're about to get scored on. And so what we did is we trained a deep Q network to human level performance. Then we run the human gameplay data through the deep Q network to output Q values. And then you can decompose these Q values into state values and action values. And what this means is basically we're isolating variance in these Q values that's related to taking the different actions and variance that's related to reward or punishment. And then we're going to enter these values into a general linear model, which is typically done in fMRI analysis, to find correlates in the brain. And what we found for action values is that there's an encoding of action values in motor and premotor regions in the brain. And these premotor and motor regions are involved in the planning and initiation of movements. And so it seems like during Atari gameplay, these areas are actually tracking the values of taking the different actions in the game. And I just plotted two representative subjects here, but the results are pretty consistent across all the subjects, basically, in all the games. And here are the results for state values. We found encoding of state value in medial prefrontal cortex. And this region is highly linked to value and reward. So interestingly, it seems that while humans are playing these games, this region is tracking the probability of reward and the probability of punishment. Okay, so we found that there's an encoding of action values in motor and premotor regions and encoding of state value in medial prefrontal cortex. The second question we wanted to ask is more about an abstract state space representation question. So which parts of the brain are constructing an abstract state space? And what do I mean by abstract state space? Here's a couple of examples of what I mean by this. So take these two frames from the game Enduro, where again, the point of the game is to drive as fast as possible while avoiding other cars. In both these situations, on the left and the right, there's a car that's directly in front of you to the right. So you should move left to avoid the car. However, these two things look very different because it's daylight in this game and it's in this frame and it's nighttime in this frame. So what a good abstract state representation should do is take these two perceptually dissimilar things and project them into a similar space in an abstract state space. So you can do the same thing in both scenarios. And then here's an opposite situation where, again, here there's a blue car in front of you to the right, and then here there's a blue car in front of you to the left. From far away, these two frames probably look really similar, but you should take opposite actions in these two situations. You should definitely not move left because you'll hit the blue car if you move left here, so you should go straight or you should stay to the right. So what a good abstract state space representation should do is take these two perceptually similar things and project them to two different state spaces so you can do the opposite in these two scenarios. And so to approach this problem, we're now using the hidden layers in the deep Q network as a model for how to do state representation. And then specifically, we're going to map representations in the brain to the hidden representations in the deep Q network. And so to do this, we're taking the trained DQN again, and then we're running the human gameplay data through it again to get neural network activations at every time point in an fMRI run. And then we're using ridge regression to model and predict the response of a voxel as a linear combination of neural network activations. So basically, we're just trying to find a mapping between representations in the brain and representations in the network. And I'll show you the results from using the last hidden layer of the network here. So here are the results for Pong. What we have plotted here is the cross-validated prediction accuracy in the model in a Pearson correlation between some of the font was messed up here. Sorry about that. But this is the Pearson correlation between the predicted time course and the actual time course in a voxel. What we see is there's actually very high prediction accuracies in a lot of regions in the brain, which you wouldn't necessarily expect because fMRI is a very noisy signal. And the particular regions that seem to be mapped to the last hidden layer are in this dorsal visual pathway of the brain. And so for a little background, there's two visual pathways in the brain. There's a ventral visual pathway that's more on the ventral surface that goes into the temporal lobes that's more involved in object recognition, so like recognizing a cat versus a dog. And then there's a dorsal visual pathway that's more involved in object localization and is more involved in visuomotor tasks. So if you're reaching for a cup of coffee, for example, this is the part of the brain that is recruited for that task. And so it looks like the dorsal visual pathway, as humans are playing these Atari games, have similar representations to what's going on in the hidden layers of the DQN. And we see similar results for Enduro, where again, this dorsal visual pathway has high prediction accuracies. We're also seeing areas of motor cortex and premotor cortex that have high prediction accuracies as well with this model. And here's the result for the last game, Space Invaders. For Space Invaders, we again see very similar regions in this dorsal visual pathway and in motor regions as well. But interestingly, we see the most frontal regions that are mapped to the last hidden layer for Space Invaders. And I think this is because Space Invaders is the most complex game of the three, so there's more frontal recruitment and more similar state space representations in these frontal regions in this more complex game. And so what we found is that regions in the dorsal visual pathway and other parietal association areas, motor areas, are mapped to the hidden layers of the DQN in all three games. And so to summarize the whole talk, AI and neuroscience have had fruitful crosstalk in the past through the lens of reinforcement learning. However, if we want to scale this reinforcement learning framework up to more real-world environments, we need to combine them with modern tools like deep learning. And our research has shown that features from these deep RL algorithms can actually be used to significantly predict human brain responses during Atari gameplay. And our research also suggests something that I think is really interesting, that both artificial and biological networks can converge to similar representations by leveraging the natural statistics of a shared task. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and the Doherty Lab, and thank you for listening. All right, any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, is there a way to look at how
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the question was, one big problem in deep RL still is that these games can only play one game. So the DQN is trained on Pong, but it can't play on Enduro or Space Invaders. But there's a lot of there's a lot of research in areas like transfer learning and meta learning in deep RL that try and solve this problem of playing multiple games. And I think one contribution that neuroscience can actually make is that humans can play a completely novel game without ever playing it before, because they have natural inductive biases in their brain about, what are objects and what are agents and what do you do in a game you try to get rewards, so you go closer to some objects and you try to avoid other objects that give you punishment. And I think DeepRL would be, could basically solve this problem a lot better if you can encode these inductive biases in the architectures more. So an understanding of what objects are from the get-go and what agents do and the psychology of how they relate with each other. And then from that point, you're just tweaking it to a particular environment that would exist in a particular game. Yeah.
Can you predict skill level based on brain activity?
I haven't actually looked at that, yeah. So potentially a separate project I would want to do after this one is look at the learning process. And I have some hypotheses of what these representations might actually do as a human is learning. So one hypothesis is that, potentially you have a representation that is dissimilar to the network at first, and then as you start to learn a task, humans start converging to a similar representation, and that representation might actually be more similar to the representations in these DeepRL algorithms. But I haven't directly tested that.
You measure that using some sort of correlation coefficient.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did you analyze the failure cases where the features from the human does not evaluate
Yeah,
what the failure
yeah, yeah. So I have done a lot of that. I didn't present it in the interest of time, but just one quick example for the game Enduro. I've looked at which filters in the convolutional layers explain human brain data better and also explain human behavior better. And then if you do like a deconvolution approach to visualize what that filter is representing, you can see some clear patterns, like the filters that are representing the score do not predict human brain responses very well at all. But the ones that are features that are detecting the cars in the game or the sides of the road are the ones that are useful for predicting a brain response. And then another thing that I found is that in particular regions of the brain, especially the ones that are in the parietal lobe, the features that are invariant to nuisances, like weather in the Enduro game is actually a nuisance. It doesn't really matter what the colors on the screen are. You should basically just be localizing the objects, irrespective of the color of them. So the features that are invariant to this nuisance actually model brain responses in the parietal cortex better than the ones that aren't.
So you could use that to make the RL also robust.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So you can imagine doing like some population training where you select a subset of the networks that predict brain responses well, and then you create children from them by, taking a subset of their features and then retraining an algorithm with those. And then over time, you might get something that's awfully brain-like and is a really good agent in these tasks.
But did you find like all the human decisions were covered by the human, or was there still something that missed tasks? Was there are you saying there are enough features in different areas and have the correlation with human decisions?
I don't think we'll ever get there, no. Yeah, there's,
What are the failure cases? Where is
yeah. Well,
it less inconsistent?
yeah, I guess the fair comparison would be like how close can you get to the optimal level depending on the noise of fMRI. And so with the noise of fMRI, maybe we can't even get above an R squared of 0.7 just because of the inherent variability of the signal. But we still are not even close to that. And I still think, even though we see some similarities here, they're awfully different still. The fact that the training on these networks is so inefficient, whereas all my subjects can learn these games in 5 minutes, even though they haven't seen them before, suggests that there are still a lot of dissimilarities between these architectures and what's going on in the brain.